Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to take off my mask because I am very far away from our guests here today. Welcome to RBCM Outside, Emily Carr's Neighborhood Tour. We're going to do a virtual tour of Emily Carr's Neighborhood. So welcome. Thank you very much for joining me. My name is Liz Crocker, and I'm a learning program developer at the Royal BC Museum. And before the pandemic, one of the programs I used to do was called Field Trippers, and I would go out to natural places, cultural landscapes around the southern Vancouver Island and meet with people in person live. And so once the pandemic started, I started doing this program. So it's a blending of Field Trippers, really. So, but we get to reach more of you. So I'm so glad to have everybody who's in the Zoom room and Facebook Live. And it was quite quiet before we started the program, but now all the machinery is starting up around us. So bear with us. So the program is a webinar format. So we can't see or hear you if you're in the Zoom room. We can only interact with you through the chat. So we will have some time for questions. So that's where you can type in your questions. And if you're on Facebook, you can type in your questions in the Facebook. And my colleague Jenny Arnold is in the Zoom room, and she can read out the questions to me and the guests. So I also want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional unceded territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people, today known as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. And so I am, as always, very grateful to be able to live and work, and especially on such a beautiful day to be here, to be able to do this program in their territory. I'm very thankful for that. And I want to let you know the last RBCM at Outside of 2020 is on December 23rd, and 2 Wednesdays from now at 2 p.m. And it is going to be up Christmas Hill. Well, there is actually a hill in Greater Victoria called Christmas Hill, if you can believe it. So I'm going to go up it, rain or shine. Goodness knows what the weather will be December 23rd. So join me 2 p.m. if you can. That would be great. And all these programs that we do, they're recorded and put on YouTube afterwards. So if you miss something or want to share it or see it later, you can watch it again on YouTube. Jenny, did you want to say something? I can hear you there.
Yeah, I was just saying, good? Yeah, I'm good. I was just saying there's a lot of people are having some lovely comments already that they're very excited for the program.
Oh, so glad. Okay, we're going to get going to the program now. If you're not aware, we actually have a temporary exhibit happening right now about Emily Carr, and it's on at the Royal BC Museum until January 24th. So the museum is open. The IMAX Theatre, unfortunately, is closed, but the museum is open. There's timed entries. You can buy tickets on the website. Please come down. It's very safe. Masks. People are spaced out. It's all good. And we also have a huge collection of Emily Carr paintings and her diaries and objects and things. So we're just really excited to be having this new exhibit happening, to have, it's called Fresh Seeing, to have a new look at some paintings that Emily Carr has done some work, but seeing it with a new lens. So for this program here, I'm lucky to be joined with a couple of guests, and one of them is his local historian, John Adams, and he knows a lot about even, the history of Victoria, but especially this neighborhood that we're in. Oh, I know, Jenny, I'm going to get you to share that slide that shows, it's a little sort of handmade map of our route today. So for folks that want to come and trace the route later themselves, you can do it. So we're at Emily Carr House now on Government Street. Then we're going to go down. We're going to turn left on Simcoe Street. And then we're going to go back down to St. Andrews Street, which turns into Maryfield, and then turn on to Government Street and end up on there at the James Bay Inn. So I think, Jenny,
unfortunately,
you're going to try and get it up there?
I've gotten an error screen. So unfortunately, we cannot share it, but unfortunately,
that's fine. That's fine. Okay, so I'm gonna start with Kate. Is that right, John? Okay. Okay. So let me flip. No, I'm gonna. Okay. Hang on. There we go. Boy, that was so fast. I hope I didn't make anyone sick. Gosh, that was a fast turn. I'm gonna try to move slower. So I'm gonna move closer to my first guest, Kate Kerr, Kate is an amazing exhibit fabricator at the Royal BC Museum. So she's done a lot of that work that you've seen in the exhibits there. And she also just happens to be site manager here at Carr House. So there she is. I'm going to put my mask back on, Kate, because there we go. And we are about 6 feet apart.
Yep.
Why don't you go ahead and tell us a little something about this amazing site?
Well, welcome everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, now known as Tongis. This is where Carr House is situated. Carr House, you'll hear more about it in a little bit as far as the history goes. I'm the new site manager here. There was a site manager here for 25 years before me. So I started in April. So I've had quite an interesting time during the pandemic to get to know the house and get to know the community around it. I do live in James Bay, just down the road, so that's an extra bonus. And as Liz said, I do work at the Royal BC Museum half-time as well. So I have those connections, which is lovely. The plans for Carr House coming up, it has been a museum in the past, and a gallery in the past, an interpretive center in the past for many decades. It's sort of changed all through different types of uses. So now I'm sort of switching it a little bit, or maybe taking it back, depending on the point of view, to being more of a community-based center for creativity, arts, writing, creative community groups and such. So right now we're working on some collaborations with the museum and with the Bateman Foundation and UVic, and we're working on exhibits, possibly also artist in residencies that would be collaborative. Bringing exhibits to this house and to other organizations around the community. We have some involvement in the local community, such as Window Wonderland, which I hope everyone's going to come out for in James Bay, which is an event where you can walk outside safely in your social bubbles and look at people's decorated windows at night. And that's February 19th and 21st, I'm pretty sure. February.
Oh, okay.
Yes, yeah. So it'll still be dark in the evenings. So wrap up, and Carr House is actually one of the warming stations and the sort of info stations that you can stop along with the New Horizons and the James Bay Community School. So that's a nice event and a family event and an outdoor safe event in James Bay. So Carr House is part of that. We have gardening workshops going on. Unfortunately, we have had tours in the house, and right now we've had to shut them down because of the health restrictions, but hopefully those will lift, and then we'll restart tours definitely this spring, as long as we are allowed to bring people into the house and show them and talk to them about Emily Carr's time here, the time of interpretation over the years. It's been interpreted as her home, and the historic preservation and restoration that's gone on here, and then our plans for things like workshops, micro conferences, programming, and all that sort of exciting stuff that I really hope that we're able to do in the near future. So that's kind of where I'm at. If you're wanting to find out more information about what we're doing, I am trying to post things on our website at carrhouse.ca, and any programming such as that. You can also reach me through that website, carrhouse.ca, if you have any ideas of what you'd like to see go on at Carr House. This is the type of thing, and then now is the time that you can approach me and we can talk. So that is where I'm at.
Thank you, Kate. I'm so excited to hear about the artistic slant that's really taking over the house. I'm sure Emily would have been happy to hear that too.
I hope so. I mean, it's always had, the previous site manager did have exhibits here occasionally and such, and artists who had shown here. I'm really trying to bring in themes of Emily Carr's life, like mentorship, definitely positive relations with First Nations, and that's what this project with the RBCM, Bateman and UVic is all about. She bequeathed her canvases and her paintbrushes to a very, very interesting man called George Kutasi, and he was an artist, but also an activist and a writer. And so we're trying to celebrate him and his work, because he was actually very influential in BC's history. And I haven't known much about him, and we like to celebrate more. I mean, some people certainly know about him, but I was shocked that I didn't know more. And so I felt like that was a good starting point to start to celebrate him and bring his story and others to the fore as part of the sort of decolonization of this site. It's a site to celebrate, but it's also a site to initiate a lot of discussions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kate. I just want to stop there. Jenny, how's our sound now? I saw that. Are we talking loud enough?
Yes, I think everything is working out just well.
Okay, now I'm going to ask John Adams to come into the frame.
Step away.
Yes, we're being very cautious here. So John Adams has been our guest before at RBCM at Outside before. Last time was in Fantan Alley. Many people around Victoria will know John. He's a historian, has worked in all kinds of projects and organizations around heritage and history for years and years. And he also owns Discover the Past, a really amazing walking tour company in Victoria. I highly recommend. Very fun to go on those walking tours. But John can also give us some historical context for Emily Carr's neighborhood. So I'm going to let John sort of take it away. He knows where we're going, and let's see what John's going to lead us, where he's going to lead us today. Okay, John, take it away.
We could go all over the map, but let's stay pretty close by. I live nearby as well. Kate was saying that she lived in James Bay. So do I, and I've lived here since 1980, only a few blocks away. So this place is part of my neighborhood too. And I had the good fortune about 30 to 40 years ago to be involved in the opening up of Carr House when I worked for the Heritage Branch of the BC government. And the house had been acquired in the 1960s by the Member of Parliament for Victoria at that time. His name was David Bruce. And he thought that the government would thank him immediately and pay him and take it off his hands. But that didn't happen right away. But eventually the government did acquire it. And without much money, in the 1980s, it fell to me and a few others to get something done. And well, there was basically nothing here. And so the wallpapers, the carpets, the furniture, everything was acquired slowly but surely until the house did eventually open to the public in the 1990s. But it'll be great when Kate has a chance to open the house again next spring, and you can see the beautiful rooms that were restored many, many years ago. But I'd like to read one small excerpt. The house, by the way, was built by Emily Carr's father, Richard Carr. He and his wife, whose name was also Emily, came here from England. They had lived in California. They went back to England, and then they decided to come back to North America. And they arrived in Victoria, and they already had one daughter who was born and came with them. Another 4 daughters and 1 son were born here. And Emily was born in this house that her father built in 1864. She was the last of the daughters, and the room she was born in, I don't know if Liz, if you can swing the camera up to that upper left-hand window, but let me read from Emily's Growing Pains, her description of what the midwife told her about her birth. I was born in a mid-December snowstorm. The north wind howled and bit. Contrary from the start, I kept the family in suspense all day. A row of sparrows, puffed with cold, sat on the rail by the balcony outside Mother's window, bracing themselves against the danger of being blown into the drifted snow piled against the window. Icicles hung, wind moaned, I dallied. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I sent Father plowing on foot through knee-deep drifts to fetch Nurse Randall. So it was one of those epic births, and Emily remembered every detail as told to her by the midwife many years later. The room she was born in was up there, and the bed that Emily was born in is also part of the collection here. A woman in the 1930s bought the bed from the estate of the Carrs after Lizzie Carr, who had lived here, died. Emily and Alice, 2 sisters, sold the place, and the bed that Emily was born in, Mrs. Carr's bed, was bought by a woman named Madge Wolfenden, and she slept in that bed until about 2 weeks before she died in the 1990s. And we had a phone call one day, and she said, John, do you want to come and get it? That was the bed that Emily was born in. So this house has lots of amazing stories. And as we look at the place, it's a typical Italianate style house of the 1860s. The paint scheme is the authentic one. Scrapings were made many, many years ago, and deep underneath the original layers of paint were found. This was the color scheme, sort of 2 tones of beige and yellow, and the very dark green trim around the windows. It wasn't a big house for such a large family, but it certainly was adequate for the Carrs. And Emily Carr, Mrs. Carr, died when Emily was just a young girl. Mr. Carr lived on for a few more years, but by the time Emily was a teenager, she and her sisters were on their own. And they had a relationship with this house, well, almost until Emily's dying days, because as we walk around the area, we'll see that each one of the sisters, including Emily, took up a piece of the property, but the focal point was always the old family home. It wasn't sold by Emily and Alice until 1937, when their sister Lizzie died. By that time, it was small rooms with gas hot plates, and that was what was cleared out in the 1960s and 1970s in order to make the house useful as a historic site. So, are we ready to walk?
I think so. I think so. And we'll just say bye to Kate. Thanks so much, Kate. She's going to go back in the house, and you might be in the room in case anybody has questions.
So I'll go on to the Zoom.
Yeah, so Kate's going to join us in the Zoom room.
Enjoy your walk.
Thank you, Kate. Okay, so I'm going to follow you, John. We're going to go out to the front of the house.
Sure. So as we walk this way, we're walking on a gravel circular driveway. And this was fairly typical of the period when the house was built in the 1860s. There was a formal garden here in the front with the formal circular driveway. But the house stands today on one city lot. That's really all that's left of the 4.5 acres that Richard Carr had purchased in the early 1860s. Eventually, the property got subdivided. When Richard Carr died, and he left the estate to the oldest sisters. And as they died, the house was passed on, the property was passed on to the younger sisters. And eventually pieces of property were sold. And this was their income. They did some work. Emily tried to make ends meet with painting and other things. One sister was a masseuse, and Alice was a teacher, a private teacher. But basically, there wasn't a lot of money coming in. So it was the property that the girls inherited that allowed them to sell pieces and to basically keep alive that way. We're coming to Government Street. Until 1905, Government Street along this stretch was known as Carr Street. Richard Carr was one of the few property owners in this area. When the land was sold by the Hudson's Bay Company in the 1860s, their nearest neighbors were on the next block over there. And there really wasn't very much in the way of housing between here and Dallas Road, which is about 3 blocks away. But it was countryside. Difficult to imagine these days as the cars roar by. And every lot is filled with condominiums or houses. But Emily was a country girl when she grew up. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why she became so interested in the natural environment, especially around her house. Just as we're getting around the corner, Thrifty's is backing up. So I'll just be silent for a moment. So we've turned onto Simcoe Street. And imagine a gravel street heading straight up to Beacon Hill Park. And Simcoe Street ran along the side of Richard Carr's property. Houses here from the 1940s mostly, but no houses here at all. While the Carrs were living here, they had a tennis court, believe it or not. Eventually, the tennis courts were sold off and these houses were built. There was also a very extensive vegetable garden just in behind, between here and Carr House, a very large vegetable garden. And there's one beautiful photograph, probably the earliest photograph known of the house, dated from 1869, that shows the gardener with all the tall flowers around him and vegetables in the background. At the back of Carr House was where the barn was. They had a cow, they had chickens, and they didn't need, it wasn't a farm, really. It was probably what we would call a hobby farm. but they certainly were as self-sufficient as possible.
Oh, I'm gonna go around.
One of the aspects of the neighborhood that has totally changed is across the street. It's just houses now, but that was a private playing field called the Caledonian Grounds, owned and operated by the St. Andrews and Caledonian Society in Emily's younger days. And there was a big board fence around the field. This was before Royal Athletic Park. And if there was a circus, if there were big sporting events, the Caledonian Grounds is where those activities would take place. And Emily writes in some of her books, the Book of Small, for example, there were many activities that they were able to take part in. They could even see them from their upstairs windows. They didn't need to pay the admission fees to get into the Caledonian Grounds. That was subdivided in 1907. But we're going to go up here a little bit farther, still on Simcoe Street, because I mentioned earlier that when the daughters inherited the property, each one in turn lived in the old house, but also built their own home on one of the lots. Emily had spent a lot of time traveling. She had gone to art school in San Francisco in the early 1890s. She went to England to go to art school. She went to France, and then for a brief while lived in Vancouver. But in 1913, she decided it was time to come back to Victoria. And, well, she was an artist. And how could an artist make a living? Well, she would have an apartment building. She would build her own. This is the building that she built in 1913. And it was designed to be 4 self-contained suites. Emily was going to choose the one that had the best view. Upper right, that was her suite. And then there were 3 more. Upper left, lower right, and lower left. She would paint while she was here. The rent that she derived from her tenants would allow her to have some leisure time, and she could paint. And so she had a studio up a little tiny stairway from her suite into the attic above upper left. And eventually she decided to paint a painting on the ceiling of that attic. Now there's a gentleman coming along on a pair of sticks, so we'll get out of his way.
I'm gonna go this.
Okay. There we go. And Liz was telling me that many years ago, she lived in one of the suites in this house.
I was just gonna say, John, I lived in the lower right one, so right beneath Emily's.
The lower right beneath Emily's.
1999.
And in the attic above the upper left, this is what Emily painted on the boards of the roof.
A little bit of reflection there. There we go.
A huge thunderbird and some frogs. This is actually a protected provincial heritage object. The house itself is in private ownership. The house is not protected by provincial legislation, but this painting is.
Yeah, I was so surprised to find that out, that you could have the attic designated as a heritage site, but not the house.
Well, I'm so glad you had a chance to take that picture when you were living here. It's something that most people will never see. It's almost impossible to get there. And well, of course, it's a private home, so most people wouldn't have a chance to see it anyway. But Emily's ability to live off the rents from this place didn't quite pan out as she had expected, because the timing was all bad. 1913, there was a big depression that year, and then World War I. She never did quite succeed as a landlady. And she spent a great deal of her time mothering and looking after the people who were here, so she didn't really have a chance to do her painting as she had hoped, at least as much as she wanted to. She raised bobtail sheepdogs and did other things to make ends meet as well. By the way, it's called The House of All Sorts today because Emily eventually wrote a book about her experiences here, and she called it The House of All Sorts as a humorous title. But her name for the place, in fact, was Hill House. Hill, Hill House, because half a block away is Beacon Hill. And she chose this particular lot because of the property that her father had left to the daughters. This was the lot that remained closest to Beacon Hill. And you can imagine Emily romping with her sheepdogs up and over the hill in the years of the 19-teens and 1920s. Anyway, so much has changed since then.
Hard to imagine this as farmland.
Really?
Yeah.
Let's walk back this way.
Thanks, John. Yeah.
And one of the things that Emily writes about in the Book of Small is a saloon that was right next door. There's a condominium there now. And it was called the Park Hotel. Her father had owned that property once, but was hard up for some money, and so had sold it. He had sold it to a man by the name of William Lush and his wife Henrietta Lush. The name should give you a clue. It turns out the Lushes owned a saloon downtown. And Mr. Carr perhaps had an inkling of what they were going to do with this property. And so he said, I'll sell it to you on the condition you must never operate a saloon there. But what did they do? The Lushes immediately opened a saloon as soon as they owned it. And Mr. Carr was very, very put out. In fact, he built a large fence between his property and the Lushes Hotel. Let's turn down St. Andrew Street.
So again, this would have been farmland at the time, or there.
It was rural land, probably mostly trees, large firs over to our right, and a grove of trees bordering Beacon Hill Park. Carr property extended right up to the park. No Douglas Street in those days. So the property ran right through to the park. And over here to the left, the barn, and perhaps the cow on its tether. And it wasn't until the property was subdivided that this street was put through. And because of the playing grounds I mentioned earlier, owned by the St. Andrews and Caledonian Society, this street was named St. Andrews Street. And there are two houses along here that were built by daughters of Richard and Emily Carr. I'm not sure where the best vantage point to see them is because of the sun.
I'm going to cross the street, I think.
Okay, so this one, yellow, easy to spot. And some of you might be able to see the oval plaque above the big window telling us that this is a designated heritage site. And this was Alice Carr's house. Alice was the next oldest sister to Emily. Emily was born in 1871. Alice was born in 1869. And she became a private teacher, primary school, kindergarten, a private kindergarten. There were many of them in Victoria in the early days. She was living in the old house behind where she was born. And then in the 1890s, she started a school a couple of blocks away on what is now Battery Street. The house is still there. And then she had this place built in about 1903. And then later it was expanded to include room for another schoolroom. And she didn't live here continuously. In fact, Emily was able to use this place briefly after World War I as her studio. But then she moved out and Alice moved in, and Alice continued her kindergarten here. But when Emily was getting a little bit older and was no longer able to look after the House of All Sorts, she had a house farther down in James Bay, but had to move out of that place. And so in 1940, she and Alice decided they would live together. Alice was no longer teaching, and the old schoolroom could be Emily's studio. And that's where Emily did her final paintings. And she was living in this house when she finally got ill, and in 1945, checked into a private convalescent hospital nearby, we'll see later, and that's where she died. But she was living here until that time.
I love this house. I love the shape of this house. And this is a good time for me to jump in and say, I forgot to say that this program is going to be a little bit longer. We're planning to go to 2:40. So we have about 10 minutes left. So don't worry. So I forgot to say at the beginning, hope you can still stick around with us because we're not quite done. So we're going to see, is there one more sister's house we can see
There's
here?
one more sister.
Okay.
You can stay right where you are.
Okay.
And just turn the camera 180 degrees.
Slowly, so people are not getting sick at home. There we go.
And right across the street, more or less across the street, it's the taller house.
Oh, okay.
Kind of a light green color.
Huh.
And that house was built in 1913 for Edith Carr, one of the older sisters. And she and Lizzie. So of the 5 sisters, one of the oldest sisters married and moved to Vancouver. But Edith and Lizzie stayed here in Victoria, and they lived on and off in the old house where Emily was born, but they both lived here as well shortly after the house was built. And it was rented out at various times. But this was a beautiful house, and until recently it was used as a bed and breakfast. I think it's a private residence now. But as we come to the edge of this property, we're coming to the end of Richard Carr's lot line. Emily said in one of her books that her father had bought 10 acres, but it really wasn't. It was 4.5. And if we look just over here, there's a driveway right here. This is just about where the Carr property starts and runs from here. 1, 2, 3, 4 lots over to Simcoe Street. So it wasn't really a very wide piece of property, but it was so half a block wide and 2 blocks long from Government Street to what is now Douglas Street at Beacon Hill Park. So let's walk down this way, continuing along St. Andrew Street. It was originally a dead end, and there was a small footpath that linked around the corner to the left onto a street that is called Maryfield Avenue. Maryfield was the name of Bishop Edward Cridge's property across the street from the Carr family. The house called Maryfield is long gone, but the street that was put out right beside the property is still here, and it's called Maryfield Avenue. So imagine a little footpath running from St. Andrew Street around here, linking us through to Maryfield. It was really not much more than a lane at the time. A couple of old houses, but lots of other houses that were built up in the 1930s and 1940s along here. But the reason to come down this way is because Emily is most famous as an artist. There's no doubt about that. And her later paintings, those beautiful bright colors, swirling skies, and strange looking trees really are what she's best known for. But when she got too old and could no longer go out into the rural areas and the remoter places, she traveled by canoe to Haida Gwaii, up the Skeena to the north end and the west side of Vancouver Island. But she wasn't able to do that anymore. She had a bad heart. I'm sure today it would be easily treated, but certainly not back in the 1930s. And so she checked in a number of times to St. Joseph's Hospital, and then later to St. Mary's Priory. That was operated as a private convalescent hospital. And she basically went there just for a rest, to be looked after by the sisters who ran it. And it was there in St. Mary's Priory where Emily died in March of 1945. So we've only walked literally a block from where she was born. And although she had lived in other places, San Francisco, England, and France, for a few years, and then Vancouver, she really spent almost her entire life within a block of this place. So just down here, we'll see what is now the James Bay Inn. People think it's rather odd that Emily died in the James Bay Inn, but remember, it was built as a hotel in the early 1900s, but it was a convalescent hospital for a short while around the time that Emily was here when she died. The hotel is a little bit unusual in some ways because of its location. It's right in the middle of the residential area in James Bay, and probably not the prime area for a hotel when it was built, but nonetheless, it was probably the sort of place where people that were coming to spend the winter in Victoria, or perhaps civil servants that needed a place to stay while they were getting established, the sort of residential hotel that might have served those sorts of people. That's why it was here. And if you look up at the top, you'll see some hand tiles, very reminiscent of the mission style from California, very popular in the early 1900s when this place was built.
Is that the brown? Sorry, is that the brown?
Okay, so the little tiny roof that sticks out just below the parapet at the top.
Okay.
It's almost like a little canopy that sticks out.
Yep.
Those are red pan tiles, very typical of the California mission style. And the very rough pebble dash, you might not be able to see it so clearly, but it's a beautiful place. Emily had checked in a number of times. The room where she died in 1945, we believe, is the room on the left-hand side, just above the entrance to what is now the JBI pub. And I think people facetiously who operate the pub say that Emily's ghost is there for some reason haunting what is now the men's washroom. But nonetheless, that is the room where she died in 1945. So it's a fabulous story of Emily's life. The neighborhood itself has a very interesting story. And we're only 3 blocks down that way to the Royal BC Museum. But in Emily's youth, in fact, right up until the time around 1900, this was rural land, and it did not connect all the way through to what is now Government Street. Government Street was put through, as we know it today, only in 1905, after the inner harbor was filled in and the old James Bay Bridge was replaced by the causeway in front of the Empress Hotel. And we could probably keep on walking. I know we don't have time. We're just about out of time. But maybe another time we can continue a walk around this part of James Bay.
Oh, it's just so dense with history.
And tell the stories of Emily. Emily wrote about it all. The strange people, the things that she saw, and some of the quirky events that went on when she was a kid. Many of them are in the Book of Small.
And a lot of people don't know her books. She was, almost equally as good writer as a painter.
She won the Governor General's Medal for some of her books. But yes, when she was no longer able to go out and paint, she put pen to paper, and her books are just as vivid and colorful as her paintings.
Well, thank you so much, John. I know you could keep going and going, but let's see if folks have any questions. We don't have a whole bunch of time, but we could certainly take a few minutes for those keeners that are still in the room with us. Jenny, are there any questions?
Liz, I can show a couple of things if anyone wants to see.
Oh, yes, please, Kate.
There is a photograph of the studio that John was talking about in St. Andrews, in the St. Andrews house, in Alice's house.
Fantastic.
But I believe taken after she died, right, John? I believe it was sort of taken maybe by the people who were looking after her will. So that's the
right.
studio, which is kind of neat. And then here's maybe a clearer picture of the attic.
Thanks,
painting.
Kate. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
one.
You can really, see the actually how the ceiling looks there.
Yeah, there's the other. Whoops, it just dropped. There's the other. And then the books. There's the House of All Sorts that she wrote about the Hill House.
Right.
We have all
Early
the books
edition.
here. These are her journals, hundreds and thousands of pauses when she was written. Clee Wick was the one that she won the Governor General's Award for, of course. So,
And I believe those are all on sale at the museum bookshop. Little plug for the bookshop, and you can buy them online too, I think.
Indeed. The Book of Small. These are the current issues, I think, put out by University of Toronto Press, but I have some of the original.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's great. Look at those original copies.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jenny. Jenny's putting a link to purchase the books in there. And I think Jenny was also going to share a link from the learning portal as well. Thank you, Kate, for sharing that. It's always nice to see those historical photographs.
Oh, you're welcome. I'll walk upstairs just in case anyone wants to see the bed that John was talking about.
Oh. Yes, and while you're walking up there, Jenny, did I see a question about one of the sisters? It went by really quickly.
Yes, we did have one question about the sisters. Did any of the sisters marry except for the one that moved to Vancouver?
No, of the 5 sisters, only Clara married, and she was the one. She stayed in Victoria for a while with her husband, Mr. Nichols, but they did move to Vancouver, and there are descendants from Clara and John Nichols.
Interesting.
Okay.
Are you there, Kate? Oh, there you are.
Yeah. So I have it not in the room. I'll show you the room where she was actually born. This is the room where she was born. I have it set up right now just as a sort of empty space because we're going to be doing artist in residence in there. But I have this as a sort of visible storage, and that is the bed right there.
Wow.
That
is something that
I should mention it was Madge Hamilton was the youngest daughter of Colonel Wolfenden and his second wife, and Madge's half sisters were much older. They were contemporaries of Emily Carr. Madge herself was born in about 1892, but she grew up knowing Emily Carr and her sisters, and she was just over visiting Emily one day at the House of All Sorts, and just happened to mention that she was on the market for a new bed, but she wanted an old one. You know, those old-fashioned sorts of beds like our parents would have had. And that's when Emily said, oh, well, get around to the old house. Alice is throwing everything out. And sure enough, the bedstead and the whole bedroom suite was in that upstairs bedroom. Madge didn't want the other stuff. She just wanted the bed. It was a double bed at the time, but Madge herself was single at that time. And so she had it cut down to 3/4 size. That's why it looks rather small.
I was wondering, I heard it was cut down, but I couldn't figure out which way. That's interesting. These are also, I think, from Madge's family home, these chairs and the little footstool. And this chair here, perhaps. And then this spinning wheel is actually from the Carr family as well.
We have a question from Facebook. Someone asked, apparently Emily Carr had a place out 10 Mile Point. Does that house still exist?
I'm not sure about 10 Mile Point. She had a place in Oak Bay, South Oak Bay, that has been moved, I believe. It was just kind of a little studio, but she did own property there. She also had a place on Oscar Street in Fairfield, not too far from Sir James Douglas School. And she would sometimes go and spend the summers in her little caravan called the Elephant out in Metchosin. There might have been other places too, but I'm not so sure about 10 Mile Point. Maybe somebody else has the details.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John. Thank you, Kate, for being with us as well and showing us the bed. That was so neat to see the bed after John had talked about it out there in front of the house. Thank you. I'm going to just going to flip the camera around again so you can. Oh, there we go. And I will say goodbye. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again, John and Kate. And any follow-up questions you could email to us and we can try to follow up with you, do our best. And hopefully you'll join us December 23rd. Who knows what the weather's going to be that day. Thank you so much. Stay safe, everybody. Bye-bye.